Hello CS112, today I'll be going over a quick solution to Lab 4, which has to do with Hansel and Gretel. So, Hansel and Gretel are starting at a house, traveling through the woods, ultimately arriving at a cake, and it is our job to print out the path they took, as well as how many breadcrumbs they left behind to make sure they don't get lost, a little, like a little trail that they can follow back to the house. A couple things to keep in mind is that their path always starts at a house and ends at a cake. There are 4 trees between the house and the cake, and each tree has a 3 breadcrumb trail. So the trail will look literally exactly like this. We can assume that the tree will always come, a tree will always come directly after the house, and a tree will always come directly before the cake. Which means that we have our 4 trees here, each separated by the remaining number of yards breadcrumbs, and we know that from the start to up to the cake it's 14 yards, so 15 yards in total, but if you're starting from 0 going to here, that's 14 yards, so that means everything in between is going to be 13 yards. So now let's just dive right into it. I'm going to start with a code skeleton here. I've already sort of copy and pasted the variables here because I didn't want to have you guys watch me do that because that'd be boring, but I've already created my variables because I don't want to have to keep repeating using those emojis because that could be tedious. And I'm going to first, since we know that it's always going to start and end at a cake, I'm going to create a starting point as well as an ending point. And this is where I'm just going to be printing out the actual start and end, which is going to be your house and cake. So in between that, though, is where I'm going to need to implement a while loop to print out the actual path. Now, something to keep in mind here is that when we're printing out the path, we are required to use a while loop. So I'm just going to have in here a comment saying print the path to endpoint. And that's really all there is to this question. This wasn't too difficult if you've been diligent about your books and projects work. So again, the starting point, I can simply just print out my house variable. And for my ending point, I can print out my end variable. Or sorry, always ends on a cake. Now within here, this is where I'm going to need to print the actual important stuff, like the path. So now when looking at this path, we need to think about a couple things. First of all, how do we want to create our while loop? How many times do we want to iterate, especially since we have gotten rid of house and cake? Well, if you just counted up the number of trees plus the number of breadcrumbs, you would come to the number 14. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I lied. There are 13. There are 13 variables that we need to consider here while iterating through our path. So I'm going to create, obviously, a counter variable for within our loop, call it I, and say while I is less than 13, because there are 13 yards there. And since I'm starting at 0, it'll still loop 13 times, but once it gets to 13, it will boot out. Likewise, if I started at 1 here, I would need to make this less than or equal to 13. But I'm going to start at 0, so I just keep it like that. Now, what do I want to do? Well, I just want to print out what I is here. I'm going to print I, and then I'm going to obviously increment I so I don't have an infinite loop. Now I'm just going to want to see what I have so far. So I'm going to run my thing with Python cat. And as you can see, I printed out numbers 13 times from 0 to 12, as well as my start and end point. So now I want to relate this information here, this path, to the numbers I printed out here. So where are my trees at, and where is my bread trail at? So my trees are going to be at index 0. I'm just going to start a comment here saying trees at 0, and then if you continue here, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have 5, 6, 7, 8, and 12. So of these indexes, of all of these indexes, those numbers have something very similar in common that we can work with using the modulus operator to determine where, uh, where the trees go. So I can simply say if I modulus 4 is equal to 0, we can print our tree. Now, why am I able to do this? Well, because we know that I modulus any of these numbers will equal 0. Or I modulus 4 any of these numbers will equal 0. And in this range of numbers, we can conclude that every single time it equals 0, it will be a tree, and if it's not 0, it will not be a tree. So I'm going to have an else in here to print a breadcrumb. So I'm just going to print bread. And I'm going to have my I plus equals 1 outside of both these conditionals, because I noticed some of you guys were having infinite loops if you had the I plus equals 1 here, or only within the else block. Because keep in mind, if this if isn't true and you have your I plus equals 1 in here, the while loop's not getting incremented and you'll enter an infinite loop. So here I have all of my stuff nice, neat, and concise here. I'm going to control S this to save it. I'm going to run it again. And as you can see, I have started and ended at a cake and a house. I have a tree immediately preceding and before the starting and end points, followed by 3 breadcrumbs within the thing. However, there are a couple things we need to do to actually finish this. In the first, I'm going to edit this to make it have, all be on the same line. So I'm going to add the end equals to get rid of the implicit new line at the end of a print statement. You could put a little space there too, so it looks a little nicer. And here I'm going to leave the new line at the end. So let's just run that again after saving it, and it's all nice and neat on the same line, like the path showed on the screen. The last thing we want to do is actually calculate how many breadcrumbs there are. Now we could just hard code it and say like, oh, there are 9 breadcrumbs, but we want to use an actual algorithm here. So I'm going to say I'm going to leave this blank for now, and let's just say num from, because we like to rhyme, and bread crumbs. And we want to calculate the actual breadcrumbs. So the way we can do this, it doesn't really matter where we do it, so I'm just going to do it with the variables here, say num crumb is going to equal. So we know that we are working with 13 variables between the tree and the house, so I'm going to start with 13, and I'm going to floor divide it by the number of trees to get the remainder of what that would be. It's the number of trees, which is 4, minus the number of trees times number of trees minus 1. So I'm going to times that by number of trees minus 1. And that will officially get you what you need to do. Again, we're doing 14 modulus 3 to see what would be the left over, and that should yield 3. So what we solve for there is sort of what the breakage point between each tree, and then we want to do 4 times minus 1 to figure out how many gaps are between each of the trees, which is why we have 4 and the gaps between for the minus 1. I'm going to save that. I'm going to run this. There are 11 breadcrumbs. So we have a small error here, which we can fix together. That is likely because I did not put this in a parenthesis, forgot the order of operations. Here, I'm going to save this. I'm going to run it again. And we got the 9 breadcrumbs. If you have any questions on this lab, feel free to leave a comment down below.